Hello, gv441 students. I wanted to present the last few slides that I didn't get a chance to do in Monday's lecture. So I had stopped in the moment where I was just about to start discussing the case for more demand stimulus after the financial crisis. Two samples of a positive case you may make for demand stimulus, why you would think it would be a good idea. One of these derives from accounting identities, and you can read more about this in the piece by Krugman that is assigned for this week's very short piece from his blog at the New York Times. And the point he makes is that it's not possible for everyone to reduce their debt at once. Why is that the case? Well, suppose that I have a debt that I want to pay back. In order to pay it back, I have to spend less than I'm earning. I have to spend less than my income and devote the difference to paying down the debt. However, if you think about everybody together, the amount that they spend is the amount they collectively earn, because my spending goes to the shops, which go to the wages of the people who work in the shops and the profits and so on. So the source of the income for everybody is everybody else's spending, which means that if all debtors are trying to pay down their debt at the same time, there can't be enough money earned for everybody to do that. So, I write here, if balance sheet effects are important, which means that if businesses and individuals have a lot of debt outstanding that they feel pressure to pay down, then somebody has to be spending more than they're earning to make that possible. This could be and should be the government, which would, by taking on more debt, would allow the private sector to repair its balance sheet. By repair the balance sheet, I mean individuals and businesses would be able to reduce the amount of debt they have outstanding and put themselves in a position where they feel like they might be able to borrow and invest once again. A second positive case for more stimulus relies on the notion of a liquidity trap, which we were talking about earlier in the lecture. Namely, in a liquidity trap, businesses and individuals, when presented with additional opportunities to hold money, will hold additional money. And this means that monetary policy is ineffective in translating low interest rates into demand. So no matter how low you make interest rates, businesses are not going to invest much more, consumers are not going to spend much more. You need to find an agent that is willing to borrow and spend, and the government could and should be that agent. Now, that's the positive case for more stimulus. Advocates of stimulus also need to respond to arguments against stimulus, arguments for austerity. And there are two ways that this might be done. One way is to say that there is very, very little evidence that in the period after the financial crisis, as long as we're talking about countries that print their own currency, and investors were worried that these countries couldn't take on more debt. So if you just look at the amount of outstanding debt in different countries, which is this column here, at the end of 2009, you'll see that the amount of debt compared to the size of the economy varied greatly across different countries, from as low as 44% in Germany to as high as 178% in Japan. And yet the interest rates that these governments were having to pay, which is over here, were not in any meaningful way related to the amount of debt they had outstanding. Where they were really high, as especially in the case of Greece, we're talking about countries, here's another one, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Italy. What do all of those countries have in common? France is lower, but still relatively high on this chart. All of these countries have in common that they don't print their own currency. They have to use the euro, which we're going to talk more about next week. So in the countries that can print their own currency, there was absolutely no sign that they faced a lack of borrowing capacity. Lenders would willingly have lent them money and permitted them therefore to spend more than they were taking in on the kind of logic that was presented earlier. Another way of challenging the case for austerity is to point out, as many people, including the above-mentioned Larry Summers, have done, to point out that austerity is very likely to be self-defeating. In other words, a government effort to cut back spending in order to reduce levels of the budget deficit and debt, because of the damaging effects on the economy, because it makes the economy smaller than it otherwise would be and convinces businesses that the economy is going to stay small for some foreseeable period, the effects of austerity are likely to be self-defeating. They make the amount that the economy can grow, what I call here the potential of the economy, smaller than it would otherwise be, so that in the end, government debt will be harder to pay back. So in those circumstances where you expect that additional government spending would have a big effect, trying to cut back on government spending in order to reduce debts is very likely to be self-defeating. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's been kind of a mystery as to why the politics of demand stimulus, which is, after all, the politics of the government borrowing more money and handing it out to people, spending it, right? You would think that would be popular. Government spending more money, putting more money in people's and businesses' pockets. Why isn't that more politically popular? There have been a few different ways that scholars have analyzed that question and tried to give answers to it. One influential position was articulated quite a long time ago by an economist named Michael Kalecki. And Kalecki suggests that in the ordinary Keynesian situation that I talked about at the beginning, right, the problem of the demand gap, investment is crucial for making up the demand gap, and insofar as investment depends on the confidence of business, when it is not confident, will not invest, the importance of investment may give business an important lever of political influence. So Kalecki suggests that if business facilitates or permits politically an active state that actively manages demand, the importance of investment by private business will be reduced, and correspondingly political influence. Governments would no longer have to think before adopting any measure, will business be annoyed enough by this policy measure that it will refuse to invest? So, active demand management, Kalecki argues, restricts the political power of business, and that might be one reason why business opposes it, even though it would allow them in the short term to sell more stuff. A second reason for austerity's political strength, and thus demand stimulus's political weakness, is that it has been hard to convince people that demand stimulus, and that's what I mean by it here, works. it's hard to convince people that demand stimulus works, because suppose a country enacts a demand stimulus and the economy still isn't doing very well. It's just doing better than it would have done without the demand stimulus. Each individual country has to demonstrate that demand stimulus works counterfactually. It has to say, if we hadn't done this, things would have been worse. Maybe things still aren't that great. How can voters assess that claim, especially if experts don't agree on it? All they can do is look at the economy and say the economy is not doing that well. It would have been even worse is a very difficult claim for people to assess. Then there are problems of international coordination that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture, that you might think that a lot of the stimulus ought to come from countries that are running export surpluses, both because they probably have better situations with the amount of government debt they have outstanding, and because they're places that are clearly under-consuming. However, there doesn't seem to be any way to make that happen. Finally, and this is a point that's raised in the piece by Mandelkern that you'll be reading for this week's seminars, demand stimulus had so much gone out of fashion as a tool of economic policy that by the time the crisis arrived, the vocabulary to talk about it, the political coalitions, the government institutions needed to think about it, all of these things had decayed very substantially versus what they were 30 years earlier. There had been a very, very heavy reliance on central banks. And so, for that reason, too, a demand stimulus policy was something of a tough sell. All right, that's the last bit of the lecture then. Thanks for listening, and apologies that I mismanaged time on Monday.